You polarize over the smallest things on social media. You unconsciously put people in boxes, call them the enemy, and feel completely superior. But here is the question that should actually shake you. What if your self-righteous anger is a complete lie? What if the person you have decided to hate is a scared human being carrying the exact same wounds as you, wearing a different label? Today, we are looking at a story about a boy who realized his worst enemy was himself. By the end of this video, you will drop those arrogant labels. You will be more real, my friend. So let's start with the first question. Why do we love dividing the world into us and them? Erich Maria Remarque wrote All Quiet on the Western Front in 1929. He had been a soldier in World War I. He knew what he was writing about from the inside, and it shows on every page. The book was immediately banned in several countries because it told a truth that people in power absolutely did not want their citizens to hear. And that truth is this: the enemy is not an enemy. The enemy is you, wearing different clothes, speaking a different language, having been told the same lies from the opposite direction. Our main character is Paul Bäumer. He is a German teenager. He is in school, he has friends, he has a whole life ahead of him. And then his teacher, Kantorek, gives a speech. Kantorek is the kind of man who has words for everything and experience of nothing. He stands in front of his classroom of young men and he tells them about duty and glory and the fatherland and the honor of fighting for their country. He makes war sound like the most important, most meaningful thing a young man could do with his life. He wraps the whole thing in language so patriotic and so stirring that the boys are moved. They sign up, all of them, in a group, together, carried by the feeling in the room. Think about it. Has anyone ever made you feel like being against a group of people was the most important thing you could do? Has a teacher, a politician, a content creator with a big following ever stood in front of you and made the division feel righteous and necessary and glorious? Why do we believe destroying the other side will make our own lives better? Because Kantorek doesn't explain what actually happens in a war. He explains what the war means. The meaning is clean and grand. The actual experience of war is something else entirely. Paul and his friends arrive at the front, and within days the illusion begins to shatter. The trenches are not glorious. They are mud and rats and the smell of death and the constant sound of things exploding close enough to feel in your chest. Men they knew, men who signed up excited and proud and full of Kantorek's words, are being killed immediately. Not heroically, randomly. A shell lands, and someone who was talking to you a second ago is gone. The glory evaporates. What's left is terror and survival, and the complete absence of any of the meaning they were promised. The enemy isn't a monster delivering righteous combat. The enemy is also hiding in mud, also terrified, also a young man who was probably given the same speech by a teacher on their side. How do the people in power trick us into hating each other so easily? Here is the crazy part. Kantorek never goes to war. The teachers and politicians and generals who create the language of hate and glory are rarely the ones who have to live inside the consequences of that language. They stay home and speak and write and make decisions, and the young men who believe the speeches go to the front and find out what the words actually cost. The boys who signed up together, who felt the rush of patriotic feeling in that classroom, are now in a trench discovering that the feeling and the reality have absolutely nothing to do with each other. Paul gets leave, he goes home, and this is where the book does something that I think is one of the most precise, most painful things Remarque ever wrote. Paul goes back to his hometown, his family, his old room with his old books on the shelf, and he cannot connect to any of it. His mother is sick and she loves him, and he loves her, and there is a wall between them he can't break through. His father wants to hear stories, wants to know what it's like, wants to feel connected to the son who went to war. And Paul can't tell him, not because he doesn't have words, because the words he has would destroy the comfortable story his father needs to believe. The older generation still believes Kantorek's version. They talk about the war with the language of purpose and necessity. They have opinions about strategy and outcomes. They are fighting the war from their living rooms with the clean, bloodless version of it that the newspapers provide. And Paul has been in the mud. He knows what the dying looks like up close. He can't go back to believing the version his father believes. And he can't make his father understand the version he knows. He goes back to the front, feeling more alone than he felt before he came home. Why does realizing our enemies are humans too feel so incredibly terrifying? Because Paul is guarding a group of Russian prisoners at one point. These are the enemy. These are the people he has been told represent something threatening and wrong, the people on the other side of the line. And he looks at them. He actually looks at them, and they are starving. They are scared. They are standing there in a group, thin and hollow-eyed, having clearly been through exactly the kind of experience Paul has been through, except from the opposite side of the same terrible situation. They are not monsters. They are not threatening. They are boys and men who were also told something by someone in a position of authority and also ended up in the mud as a result. Paul watches them and something shifts. He can see their faces. He can see the specific expression of someone who is hungry and frightened and very far from home. And that expression is not foreign to him at all. He has made that expression himself. His friends have made that expression. The enemy is wearing it. They all look the same when the labels are removed, and what's left is the human being underneath. What happens when you are forced to look the person you hate directly in the eyes? Here is the scene that has stayed with readers for 100 years. Paul is caught in a shell hole during a battle. A French soldier falls into the same hole, panicking in the dark, and Paul stabs him in a reflex of pure survival. And then the man doesn't die immediately. He lives for hours. And Paul is trapped in that hole with him, watching him die, unable to leave, unable to do anything. And he looks at this man. He goes through the man's pockets. He finds a wallet. And in the wallet there are pictures, a woman, children, a family. This man has a wife. He has kids. He had a whole life before someone told him there was an enemy he needed to fight. He was a printer. His name was Gerard Duval. He had a specific human life with specific human people in it, and now he is dying in a hole in the ground, because he and Paul happen to end up on opposite sides of a line drawn by men who are not in this hole. Paul talks to him, he apologizes, he calls him a brother, he means it. He is holding the hand of the man he killed and calling him brother and meaning it completely, in the way that you mean something completely when it is too late to act on it. What happens when the labels and ideologies you fought for suddenly mean nothing? Because in that shell hole, German and French mean nothing. The labels that sent them both to the front, the speeches and the patriotism and the carefully constructed hatred of the other side, none of it is present in that hole. What's present is one dying man and one man who killed him, and the complete, devastating recognition that they should have been strangers who never had a reason to hurt each other. They were made into enemies by people who didn't have to get into the hole. Paul gets out of the hole eventually. He goes back to what's left of his unit. His friends are dying one by one. The people he went to war with, the group who believed Cantoric's speech together in that classroom, they are disappearing. Not in heroic ways, in random, senseless ways. A sniper, a shell, sepsis from a wound that wasn't treated quickly enough. Each death is the end of a person who had the same dreams and fears as anyone else, removed from the world for reasons that made sense in a speech and make no sense in a trench. Why do we realize we have everything in common with others when it is too late? Because it requires proximity. It requires the labels to be stripped away by circumstances. Paul didn't decide to see the humanity in Gerard Duval. He was forced to by hours in a hole with him, unable to look away, unable to maintain the abstract category of enemy when an actual human being was right there dying in his arms. Most of the time, we don't end up in the hole. Most of the time, we stay at a comfortable distance where the labels hold, where the other side remains an idea rather than a face. This is exactly what happens online. The person on the other side of the argument is not a person. They are a username, a political position, a collection of opinions that you have decided to hate. You don't see their family photos. You don't hear their voice break when they talk about something that actually hurt them. You see the label and you respond to the label. And the label is very easy to hate. Paul is having no problem hating French soldiers when they are an abstract concept. The moment one of them is in the hole with him, dying, the hatred becomes impossible to maintain. Why is forgiving our enemies actually the exact same thing as forgiving ourselves? Because the enemy was made, not born. Paul was made into someone who could kill by the same forces that made Gerard Duval into someone who could kill. Both of them were young men who had told a story about why the other side was the problem. Both of them believed it enough to be there. Forgiving Duval for being on the other side of the line means recognizing that Paul, being on his side of the line, was equally arbitrary, that neither of them chose the position, that both of them were used, and that is the recognition that actually heals something. It is not about the specific enemy and the specific war. It is about the whole mechanism, the way authority manufactures division, the way leaders create hatred between people who have no actual conflict with each other in order to serve purposes that have nothing to do with the people doing the fighting and the dying. Why do we hold on to our anger when we know it is poisoning our own minds? Because the anger feels like it means something. The anger feels like a position, like clarity, like knowing who you are in relation to the world. Paul gave up a lot for the anger. His youth, his friends, his ability to connect with his family, his belief in the teachers and institutions that told him the enemy was worth hating. Giving up the anger means all of that was for nothing, and that is too large a loss to face. But holding on to the anger is also a loss. It is the ongoing loss of every moment you spend in it. Every hour you spend hating the other side is an hour you are not spending on anything that actually builds your life. The anger is a fire that burns in you, and the fuel it runs on is you. And then Paul dies. It's a quiet day. The front is calm. He is looking at something, a butterfly in some versions of the image people carry from this book, something small and ordinary and alive, and he reaches toward it, and a sniper fires, and he falls. The official military report for that day says the same thing it says on all the quiet days. All quiet on the Western Front. No significant activity, nothing to report. Paul Boymer, who watched his friends die one by one, who spent hours in a hole with a man he killed and called him brother, who went home and couldn't speak to his father, who gave everything he had to a war that was manufactured by people who will never be in a trench, is recorded as nothing, a quiet day. If you could see the fragile human behind the label you hate, would you finally drop the knife? Here is the honest answer this book gives you. Maybe, if you were in the hole with them. If you were forced into proximity close enough that the label had to give way to the actual person. If circumstances stripped away the comfortable distance that makes hating easy. But we are not usually in the hole. We are on our phones, or in our feeds, or in our conversations with people who already agree with us, reinforcing the labels and the divisions from a safe distance. And the system that benefits from our division is counting on us staying at that distance. Kantorek is still giving speeches. He is giving them in different formats now, different platforms, different languages, but the structure is identical. Here is the enemy. Here is why they are wrong. Here is why you need to fight them. Here is why it is righteous and necessary and important that you hate them. And on the other side of whatever line is being drawn, someone else is receiving the same speech about you. Let's be honest. Remarque wrote this book after fighting in a war and watching his generation be destroyed by it. He was not writing theory. He was writing from the specific knowledge of what happens when humans are sorted into categories and pointed at each other. He knew what the faces looked like up close. He knew what the labels disappeared into when you were actually in the mud together. The book was banned because it told people something the people in power needed them not to know. That the enemy is not an enemy. That the division is manufactured. That the hatred you feel for the other side is a product that was sold to you by someone who benefits from you feeling it. You can put the product down, not because your concerns aren't real, not because every disagreement dissolves into imaginary harmony, but because the person on the other side of the label is carrying the same fear you are carrying, the same doubt, the same hope that their life will amount to something, the same love for the people close to them, the same body that can be hurt and the same mind that can be exhausted and the same capacity to end up in a hole somewhere, stripped of the label, looking at another human being and recognizing them. Paul recognized Gerard Duval. Too late, but he recognized him. You don't have to wait until it's too late. The fragile human behind the label you hate is right there. They have always been right there. The label was placed between you by someone who needed you not to see each other. Take the label off. Look at the person. They are you.